adult education is just not about getting your GED or high school diploma. It's about building a future and using education to know what those next steps are.
Welcome to Currently the Conversation, brought to you by TVC Cherry Capital Airport, your Northern Michigan connection. Today we're talking about second chances, resilience, education, and the life-changing power of adult learning. Joining us is Christy Nelson, Regional Director of Adult Education at Northwest Michigan Works, serving a massive 10-county region across Northwest Michigan. Christy has spent decades helping adult learners earn their high school diplomas, complete GEDs, improve literacy skills, and open doors to careers and opportunities that may have once felt out of reach. She was recently honored with the Michigan Adult Community and Alternative Education Association's Lifetime Achievement Award, recognizing a career that's been dedicated to transforming lives through education. And with the upcoming adult education graduation ceremony happening June 10th, this felt like the perfect time to talk about the impact of adult education, not just on individuals, but on families and communities and workforce development, and even generational poverty. Christy, my friend, thank you so much for being here today. It's so great to have you.
It's such a pleasure to be here and talk with you.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. And I have to say this because we're recording this on Wednesday, May 20th, and it's your birthday.
It's my birthday.
So happy birthday to you. I'm so happy that I honestly can't believe you chose to spend it with us.
Oh, well, I consider this a very good gift. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. I want to start by talking about your journey, your journey into education. And if you can take me back a bit, how did you first find your way into education? When did you first realize that you wanted to be a teacher?
Well, I think my brothers and sisters can tell you that answer because since the very beginning, people would play outside. I would play teacher. And I'd make them sit down and I'd make them do all sorts of things. So really, it has always been a life passion to be a teacher. I can't tell you where it started, but I think it started inside and it was just a gift I had.
Yeah.
And I enjoyed doing it.
And we always think about teachers in a classroom, but teachers are all around us.
Absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. I really talk. So there's lots of staff on board for adult education program, but I tell them all they're all teachers. Yeah. We have formal teachers that have certifications, but all of our jobs are about teaching and sharing and helping people move forward.
Was there a moment that you just knew? Like, you've kind of had this idea where you're playing school as a kid, and then you're growing up and getting into the, world where you have to decide what you want to do, that you were just like, well, of course I'm going to be a teacher.
I think that, that's an interesting question because I don't know if you know the statistics of how many teachers go into training to be teachers and then they go into practice teaching and discover, I don't like this at all.
Yeah.
So I think that magical moment when I said, no, this is good, I like this, is when I started teaching.
Wow. Yeah.
So, I said, oh, yep, this feels right. And I got an opportunity to teach in 3 different areas because I got certified with young children and special ed, and then a little bit of K through 8. And so I thought, I really like all of it. I really like the diversity and just the feeling of sharing and learning.
But, having all of that certification with so many different age groups, right? From young children to making the decision to, move toward adult education, what, originally drew you toward adult ed?
Quite honestly, it was an advertisement
really?
in a newspaper. So I moved to Michigan from Texas, and I had 4 children under the age of 5.
Okay.
And so really realistically, to get a job and pay for daycare was unrealistic. And so I was kind of moaning the fact I'm really not a homebody person. I love my children and love to stay home, but I was not a stay-at-home mom. And so when I saw that job application, I said, this is interesting. And really when I stepped foot in there, I said, oh, this is my place.
This is your place.
This is my place.
And that's when you realize, like, adult learning, that's where I'm supposed to be?
Yeah. Because, Christal, I think that with adults, with kids, you've got a blank slate and you're teaching them. With adults, you're teaching them teach themselves. You're teaching them how to learn. And so it's not so traditionally, I'm standing here teaching you.
Yeah.
It's all about the empowerment and helping them find themselves and be proud of themselves because they know how to do that.
I went back to, I got my my degree late in life. I was over the age of 40.
Mm.
And so I was one of those people at NMC that was older and taking these classes. And I really felt like in that period of time that the instructors, the teachers were teaching me that some of the things I thought about myself were untrue. In particular, I remember getting really anxious about having to take a required math class for the degree that I was pursuing. And I took this math class, and I had this really great teacher who was like, "Who told you weren't good at math?"
Oh my gosh, yes.
And it was something that had been said to me, and I can remember the moment it was said to me in 5th grade. And the teacher, who didn't even mean to think that this was, I don't think she ever thought that this was going to last with me. But I had been doing very well in math. And then we went into this new type of math, and I didn't get it right away. And she said, "I just don't think math is your thing."
Oh, no. Ouch.
And I had held on to that. So I feel like sometimes with adult learning, what you're doing too is breaking down those barriers that maybe some other people have built for people.
Well said. Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
indeed. Absolutely. I think that, what I tell my teachers every day, the adult ed teachers, and I say it so often, they say, "Stop telling us that, Christy." But I said, what is the greatest predictor of student achievement? You know what the answer is? It's what they believe.
Oh.
The teacher expectation. So if your teacher thinks you can't do it, they'll
Probably
fulfill
not.
that expectation. And so your teacher told you you're probably not good at math, and so that became your belief.
Yeah. It's so interesting too, because in all of the classes I took in college, that ended up being the one I liked, which is so, I mean, I loved all of them, but like, I really was like, oh, I really do like math. I just never realized I did, you know? It's very funny.
And so with adults, you empower learners to learn. You teach them to learn.
Yeah. I have to ask too, you've spent many years in this field. What has kept you in that work?
Honestly, I think it's hope. Because hope that, you see all these adults who failed, who struggle with that failure, who've been told I'm not good at something. And when you can give them hope that can be changed,
right.
You give a hope for them, you give them hope for their families, and you keep that hope within yourself that you can, as we talked a little bit before this conversation, you can make a difference. Do we always see it? No. But there's hope that it's there and that you're making that change. And I think that's what keeps me going.
When you're thinking about, we can talk about how systems have changed over the years. We can talk about how funding has changed over the years. There's so many changes over the years. But I want to ask about how students have changed over the years. Have you seen a change in the students themselves, or have you seen a change in the barriers they're facing?
I think it's difficult to typecast because we treat our students as individuals. It's individuals instruction, 100%. So there's no learning disabilities. There's no learning you're not good at something because you're only competing against yourself.
Yeah.
That's the only thing you do. So I think that that question is difficult to ask because the only major shift I've seen in all the time I've been was immediately after COVID.
Right.
Because our typical adult ed student is between 22 and 54, and they all are mainly female, and I think that's typical of the post-secondary. But after COVID, we saw a shift, and they were majorly high school students, 19 to 22 years old, majorly, and they were male. And that was very interesting. A shift as in like 60% of our population was that.
So many kids in high school at the time struggled during COVID. And I can speak with experience to my son, Logan, who incredibly talented, very, very intelligent child. But learning online was just not something he could do. He just couldn't do it. And getting him across the finish line for graduation was tough.
Yeah.
So I'm imagining a lot of young people at the time of COVID had the same issues.
Well, Christal, lots of kids didn't have that support from parents to get them across the line. Yeah. And it's not, I'm sure, that the parents didn't want to. It was simply that they didn't have the capability. Many of them were working jobs. Many of their parents were frontline workers, so they were still working. They weren't at home. So
Wow.
That's the biggest shift I've seen.
Wow.
in all the time I've been.
And so recent too.
So
then.
recent, yeah.
Wow. So you were recently honored with the Lifetime Achievement Award that I mentioned at the top of the show. I have to ask what that recognition meant to you personally. Did it feel like, did it give you a chance to reflect on your career and go, yeah, I have done a lot of things?
Well, I think the first thing I always say when people say you got a Lifetime Achievement Award, it says, wow, you're really old and you made it thus far.
No.
But that being said, I really felt very blessed and honored to get this. And when you talk about reflection, it's a journey, absolutely. And I think what my reflections were more as the people that I had along the way to help me achieve that goal, really, because I had so many people, as we talked a little bit before, that kept saying, yes, go ahead and try.
Yeah.
So, when it started as a fresh young person, and it was the state adult ed director who I said, hey, I have an idea about something. And it had to do with distance learning with the first recession, and we're so rural. All these people couldn't drive in.
Yeah.
Do they choose food or, their groceries or getting to jobs? And so I said, would you be willing to give me a small grant to buy Chromebooks and jetpacks? And so we started way a long time ago because we were rural. And she said, great idea. So, we were kind of the first ones in adult ed to be doing distance learning because of that nature. And she said yes. So, and then I had administrators, Elaine Wood, I don't know, and Janice Warren, wow, and Janie and Jessica, all are very supportive. So, along that journey, there are people that are stories of their relationships, their connections, including staff, including family that all helped you along the way. And when I reminisce, I say, wow.
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to have had them in my life.
I know we were talking before we started the show about, you and I both having I feel so honored to work for Networks Northwest as my day job.
Yeah.
And you have built a career with Networks Northwest and Northwest Michigan Works. And one of those important pieces of that is that it's an organization in general that says, I don't know how to make it happen, but we're going to figure out how to make it happen.
Yes. Yes. Let's figure it out.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a great problem solver.
Yes.
Let's look at alternate ways to do things. And so I think if that's what I'm proudest of is that ability to be able to do that, think outside the box.
I'd have to say that there has to be student stories that have stayed with you through the years. If you think about, maybe you're just like thinking about your career or thinking about all the students. You told me briefly about a student that didn't, he started kind of not on his own merit. Like it was just like somebody said, you have to go do this.
Yeah, right.
And he didn't make it.
No.
And you were very accepting of him when he came in, and when he didn't show back up, it wasn't like there was judgment or anything else. Then a few years later, he walked through the door. And he's older, he's taller, he's definitely but you recognized him immediately.
Yeah, sure.
Those kinds of things. And he's back.
He's back.
And he made it.
Well, we often say to our students, when they stop coming and stop attending, we say, well, you're not dropping out, you're stopping out.
Oh.
So we expect whenever you're ready to come back and whenever you can do that, we're ready for you. And you can pick up right where you left off.
Yeah.
Because we don't want them to sense failure again. That's what they experienced in school, and we don't want to hear them. So we try to give them the mindset that, don't worry, it's okay to come back.
Yeah.
It's not a failure.
And there's no judgment.
Yeah, no judgment.
I love that.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people who hear adult education and automatically think GED. Right? So you're just like, oh, you got your GED. But the work is so much broader than that.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what adult education really encompasses today?
Sure. I think I'm going to use a story for that.
I'd love to.
And it was a recent story. So, yes, most students come in and they say they want their GED, but we help expose them to it so much more because we help them with digital literacy skills, and we help them plan a career goal with the next step. But we had like a young 21-year-old student come in, and I think it was a little bit of push by his mom to come get his GED. But one of the typical things we do when people enroll is to get their transcript. And so he got his transcript, and the teacher was super excited because when we did an evaluation, he only needed one more credit to graduate.
Wow.
And this was about a month and a half ago. So when he came in, he said, the teacher told him that he could only he only needed one more credit, and that we're having graduation on June 10th. And if he finishes, he could attend graduation. And she said his whole demeanor changed from the cocky long kid being forced to come to school to one. And he said something, and I'm going to butcher the quote, but it was so beautiful. He said, when I walked through the door, I could only think of my future to the end of the month.
Oh.
Now I see a future for the rest of my life. Wow.
What?
So we don't just do GEDs. We do high school diplomas. We help people with basic skills. Another interesting story is we had a PATH person who was going to get a job at Home Depot, but he was from another country, so we had to teach him how to use measuring tapes in the U.S. things, measuring tapes and different tools to measure. He was there for 2 weeks and done, and he got his job, and our job was done at that point.
Well, and I mean, being from another country, probably on the metric system,
right,
and
exactly.
just like I don't know how to read by feet and inches, and that's fantastic.
So we always say Michigan Works and Networks Northwest statement is there's no wrong door. We're a no wrong door program, and I think that's adult ed. There's no wrong door. There's no wrong reason for coming to school.
Yeah, but there's a lot of barriers that adult learners face, and I found it really interesting too. Before we sat down today, you had mentioned that adult education used to look just like it does in a classroom, where people were really expected to be there at 9 a.m. and leave at 3 p.m.
Yes.
And I was thinking about that for a couple of days after we talked about that, Christy, because I was like, how would that work for people who, some of the reasons maybe that high school was a barrier are still existing.
Yep.
So, what are some of the, the barriers that people are facing when they do walk through those doors now, even with all of the flexibility?
I think, honestly, Christal, the biggest barrier for adult students is their own perception of themselves. They have all the typical barriers that everybody has.
Yeah.
They have transportation and childcare and all of that. But thinking it's changing their mindset from I can't to I can.
Yeah.
And sometimes that's not a battle we win. We don't, but maybe 5 or 6 years later we do.
Yeah.
We win. It just takes a while for them to be ready to face that and say, I'm good. I feel good about myself. I can do this.
So what is something that you wish that more people understood about adult learners then?
I think that they're very strong, capable members of society. Another story, we had a student from a local school district who was 19 years old who came to us and said, I want to come to school, but I can't go to my school anymore. They told me I couldn't finish. I was never going to finish. She started and she was put in special ed in 2nd grade because she couldn't read. So the teacher came to me later and said, I think this person is really smart. Would it be okay if I read to her the questions? And I said, sure.
Yeah.
And so she started reading to the questions and discovered, wow, this is great. And so we applied for accommodation for a GED, and we went back to the school district to get the paperwork. You know what they said?
What?
Good luck.
Oh.
Isn't that heartbreaking? And we said, thank you. We said, thank you. That woman finished her GED in 9 months.
Wow.
9 months out of not reading since 2nd grade. Could she magically suddenly read? No, we didn't cure that. But with technology today, Christal, she doesn't have to read. She can use tools, but she could comprehend, and she knew all the important things for the GED, which are skills, and she had those. She just couldn't read. That was one.
And she did it.
And she did it.
Oh.
And we have lots of stories like that.
Wow.
Lots and lots.
I you mentioned COVID. Sort of the evolution of what the traditional adult learner looked like, going from mostly women, mostly 20 to 25 and plus, and to younger people. Do you think that COVID also changed adult education needs or delivery? You mentioned distance learning, things like that. Do you think that the way we think about adult learning changed after COVID?
I think that delivery systems have changed, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because I think people got comfortable with working at home. And I'm sorry, but I really still think people are still a little bit afraid, of COVID and those things. And so we're seeing a dramatic still change and shift in people wanting to work at home.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense.
But, technology has allowed us to make those connections. So we just have to help our teachers get better at it.
So I'm here with Kevin Klein, who is the Executive Director of TVC Cherry Capital Airport. And Kevin, people love to travel, but not everybody is very good at traveling. I'm sorry to say it, but what are some of your travel tips from Kevin's Corner?
Plan on being early.
Yeah.
Plan coming 2 hours early. We've got lots of great things to do for you. But the reason you want to plan to come in early is if you're checking bags, the bag cutoffs for most airlines are 45 minutes prior to departure. Each airline has different policies, so check that with your airline. But being there through the line to make sure your bag is back and being screened 45 minutes before departure, you have to plan for that. You can't come just at 45 minutes prior to. So you check in plenty of time early, and then I always say, bring your patience.
Yeah, preparation, planning, patience. Just a few travel tips with Kevin Klein. Now, how can people find you?
They can find us at tvcairport.com.
I'm going to kind of segue into talking about the regional challenges because most of the folks who work with Networks Northwest, specifically in Michigan Works programming, operate working through a 10-county rural region, right? So we have some pockets of city, if you will, but still rural, right?
Sure, we are.
And serving a 10-county region has a lot of unique challenges. What does that look like for you and your program across Northwest Michigan? I mean, you have dozens of staff members.
Sure.
You're serving dozens of schools and school districts and individuals. I mean, what does it look like?
That's very perceptive because, with all of our other programs, you're serving a town county area. I'm serving a 10-county area, but also all those school districts and all those intermediate school districts, all who have different rules and regulations. So it takes, I mentioned to you before our conversation we started today that I'm not a salesperson, but probably I am because half of what you do is convincing people that this is a good idea. We had an initiative where it was called TABIT, Transitioning Adults into Post-Secondary Education and Training, and we had all the local community colleges part of this program. And I remember so clearly that the state came to visit and tried to find out, why is this so popular? Why did it work? Yeah. And one of the superintendents of one of the colleges, Baker College, said, because Christy convinced us that it was the right thing to do. And I just went, wow. He believed in the mission. He believed in what we were trying to do.
Yeah, but you also, when you're looking at all those intermediate school districts and all of those different counties and people kind of lump our region together.
They do.
But the needs in Petoskey are very different than the needs in Lake City.
Even the population. I think the biggest divergence I see is between the big cities like Petoskey and Traverse City because that Petoskey doesn't have they don't have a good transportation system. And somebody actually said at a meeting, well, we don't really need one. And I said, oh my goodness, that's a really a narrow-minded way to think. So it's hard. So convincing them, I don't think they just know. I don't think they know. So it's making them aware and then helping them see the need. And we've done that. We've had those conversations and really worked to build those rapports so that they understand.
I think beauty can be a blinder sometimes. So when you look at beautiful Petoskey and
it is beautiful.
Traverse City and views of the bay and everything like that people forget about all the other things that are real problems around them, and being access to transportation, broadband access is still a major issue.
Absolutely.
And I think that there are people who are probably listening right now, again, using internet, right?
Right.
And going, what are you talking about? But it's real. Yeah. These are some of those barriers that still exist.
An interesting perception is when we started, and I mentioned, we got the jetpacks for internet access and the Chromebooks. Well, we're starting to see that people are checking them out less and less. Yeah. So I was wondering, why is that? Why is that? Do we really need them? Well, people are using their phones now for access, and those have a wider range and variety. And so again, no, that's interesting. Maybe they don't. Maybe that's not as important a thing that we need to focus on, and we certainly, with the price of gas, need to help with transportation costs.
So I want to talk a little bit about the larger impact. And one thing that I think it's not always the it's not always the thing that people want to talk about, right? But there's an economic impact.
Absolutely.
When someone earns a GED or a high school diploma, finishes a program, there's a huge economic impact there. Do you have data that shows how adult education impacts lifetime earnings or workforce participation?
Absolutely. There's such a strong numbers to show. It also helps with incarceration, right?
Yes.
And recidivism. They don't go back when you give them a positive thing that they can look forward to. Absolutely, the economic impact is huge. But what we really try to work with our adult ed students, and I think that's one, when you talk about barriers, is helping them understand the next step.
Yeah.
Many of them come through the door just saying, I just want to get my GED, but we help them try to understand the economic impact of continued education and helping them navigate to that next step.
And, I think, I went to high school in the 90s, and I think in the 90s it was just, you're going to go to high school and then you're going to go to college and then you're going to get a degree, and that's like the only path.
Right.
But specifically, like learning a lot more about your program and working with Networks Northwest and Northwest Michigan Works is that's not the only path.
No.
And my goodness, getting someone from a GED or a high school diploma and then immediately transferring into a training program.
Right. Yep.
I've seen this happen with some of your students where I'm like, wow, 6 months ago, this is an individual that hadn't completed high school education and now is going into a CDL program.
Yes.
It's incredible.
It's incredible. And it's so rewarding. We're finally making pretty big nudges in that area where, in fact, at graduation, one of the things for graduation was we have graduation speeches, and each one of those graduation speeches are talking about the next steps.
Yeah.
Wow, that really hasn't happened very often. One's going into nursing, and it's interesting. The teacher said, "Oh, she wasn't thinking about nursing." And we had one student that took 3 years to just pass the math part of the GED test, and they took him on 3 campus visits, and he settled on NMC, and he's going in welding.
Wow.
So, it's just crazy.
That's
it's
amazing.
Wonderful. Yep.
We have to talk about the generational impact. I do think one of the most powerful aspects, and something that our supervisor, Jessica Willis, who's the director of Northwest Michigan Works, she has noted that the graduation ceremony for the adult education students is probably the most heartwarming day that she experiences on the job. And she always talks about the people who have the children that come up with them. And I want to think about what that means for the child. Like, what happens inside a family when a parent returns to school and that child gets to see their parent complete that. Like, that is life-changing.
It is life-changing. We, I think one of my favorite stories when I was a beginning teacher was a parent, and back in the old days, courts often required parents, so if their kids were, weren't going to school and the parents got in trouble, or if the parents got in trouble the judges would force them to go back and get their education. So I had this woman come in, and she was very colorful in her conversation and would say lots of colorful words and was not happy to show her discourse for being there. Yeah. But you know what? We convinced her that she was smart because somebody told her she wasn't. Yeah. And this woman was very smart. And she passed her GED in record time. So the turnaround of that was one day I was driving to work and I saw her in the streets, in her slipper, in her robes, swatting her son with a broom saying, "You get to school. You're going to get to school and you're going to finish." Yeah. And ironically, she had 3 sons who were kind of wild kids who all finished school. That was the impact of helping her see the value of education.
And her children see the value. I mean, on a personal note, my mother was a teenage mother. She's a wonderful mother. And incredible person. And I remember being a child going to school, and she was going back to school.
Mm-hmm.
And she ended up in a career tech center program for graphic design. And this is way before computers. And she's a really good artist.
Wow.
And I remember the pride I felt, like seeing my mom, whose artwork was on display at like a National Cherry Festival event, and like just being like, my mom's in school for this, and she's doing this. And she had finished her GED, and she had done that. And I don't think she's ever really understood what that modeled for her children.
Yes.
Because she did make a big deal about it. She wasn't like, look at what I did. Mm-hmm. But it was just us looking and saying, look at what you did. And also knowing how hard she worked. I mean, she's working jobs. She's a single mom. She's doing all these things. I think, I can look to my siblings and to myself and go, that was a life-changing moment. That her gaining her education broke a cycle.
It broke a cycle. Mm-hmm. Yes. Planting the seed. So many stories of that. The most beautiful one I remember was an adult who graduated. She was in Head Start. A teacher helped her navigate to our adult ed program, and she graduated. And then she always had a dream of going to nursing, but didn't think, I can't do nursing. Yeah. And she did nursing, and she graduated, and her son graduated and came to her and said, I think I want to go to college too. And she said, well, I don't know how to help you do that, but I know who to ask. We gave her the tools to figure out how to do that. So, and we talking about graduation and graduation speeches is probably 90% of them will relay in their speech. They're doing it because they want their kids to value education too. Yeah. To show them that it's important.
And there's also research connecting education attainment to, like you said, lower incarceration rates, improved health outcomes, greater civic engagement. Do you see those ripple effects in the work?
Absolutely. In fact, some of the gains that we track are, being more active in your children's education, going to a library, go figure that. Why would that be a gain? But really, many times, if you're not and I'm going to say undereducated, a library is not probably someplace you're going to go because you don't feel comfortable. So we see all those secondary goals and secondary things that happen because they've made their gains.
So the graduation ceremony is coming up on June 10th. It's at Milliken
Auditorium.
Which is a beautiful space.
It is. We want to make it beautiful and special for them. So.
And it is. Can I ask, you've done this quite a few times now.
I have.
How many times have you
been
a part of graduation? Do you know?
I do. Okay. I do. As an administrator, and I remember when I started as a teacher, they had a graduation ceremony in a really cramped place at the Career Tech Center. Oh. It was hot. There wasn't any place for the parents to stand, and I said, I'm going to change that. So it's been about 24 years ago.
Wow.
Yeah, and the Milliken Auditorium, Dennis Museum, been very supportive. Yeah. We get a discount for a nonprofit charge to it, and they've always and then plus it sends a message to students. Oh, you can go on to school here. Look at this campus. So it's sort of a secret message to them.
It is a beautiful space, and that's a space that graduates of NMC go. Right? So it's like it's a beautiful space to graduate. What is that day like, though, emotionally for you?
I have to tell you, I call it my reward because I mentioned to you, and we talked at the beginning, I'm a teacher at heart, literally born as a teacher. Yeah. And so it's hard to become an administrator because you don't get to see that immediate reward when you work with students and talk with students. So I get to see that reward on that day. And it is very emotional to watch them across the stage. Yeah. And I think I'm probably the one that claps the loudest as they cross it. It's really great. Very, very wonderful.
Kind of getting back to the challenges and some of the unique opportunities that you have, like leading a program across 10 counties and with so many different schools and ISDs. You also lead a very large team across that geographic region. And I always wonder, because I have a small team, and you have a very large team.
Big team.
How do you keep your staff engaged with each other and motivated in this emotionally intensive work?
I think that's really, again, very perceptive because I once did a workshop about what is the difference between a leader and a manager. And a leader guides. They set the mission. They set the feeling. Why is this important? And I don't know if my staff don't like it, but whenever I ask them to do something, I explain why. Why? Why are we doing this? Why is this purpose? Why? I know this seems hard, but this is why it's hard and why we should do it. So I think helping them, I think you have an effective team when they all believe in the same mission and they're all working to the same goal and care about it the same way. I think that's what's important.
What do you think are the qualities that make someone effective in adult education versus maybe in traditional K through 12?
Well, I ask this question of every teacher that applies for the job. And the question is, if you had a student who came to you with a question that you had no idea what the answer was, what would your response be? And, I get quite a variety of answers.
Yeah.
What do you think the answer is that, Christal? What would you answer?
How would I answer?
How would you answer?
I don't know, but I'm going to help you find out or something like that.
That's exactly right.
I passed.
You passed. You could be a teacher. Well, you need a new job. Come on over. That's exactly right, because we'll learn together.
Yeah, we'll learn together.
And we'll learn together, and that's what makes a good teacher. I have to say that if people answer, I'll find out the answer. I had one teacher say, I probably know the answer, and he didn't get to the next question.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't, because really you need to be a collaborative learner with your student to be a good adult ed teacher.
We can't have this conversation without having a conversation about funding and challenges.
Yes.
And adult programs often operate with seriously limited funding, despite the enormous impact that you have. What do you look at as some of the biggest funding challenges right now?
You asked a couple, and I'm going to go a couple of questions back because that's a big answer. Believe it or not, Christal, when I started in this position, I ran 10 learning labs on $128,000 funding. And of course, that was quite a few years ago.
Sure.
Money went a little bit farther. But I always say I was able to run those programs. We were able to effectively run them because we lived with our parents. So Networks Northwest, then Northwest Michigan Council of Government, really supported all those outside, the building, the phone, all electricity, just like you'd get for your parents. And we did the work. So the funding was a challenge. We've had ups and downs. But really one of the things I'm proudest of is when the funding changed from a seat time where adults had to be in a seat to where they now could be. Yeah. It's just a grant base. So they could get it individualization. They can get it in 2 weeks, their GED, or they can take 2 years. It just depends. So the funding has shifted to allow us to do that. Yeah. But that being said, oftentimes people don't think adult ed is as important as K-12. Many people, oftentimes politicians say they had their chance. We shouldn't have to give them another chance. Yeah, it's hard. So again, I guess it's back to that salesman's job, is going and talking to them and showing them what's the value for their money, and showing them the impact of economic impact and community impact when you have an educated workforce.
How can we make sure that those policymakers are at the June 10th graduation? Because I think that'll change their mind.
You know what? We standardly send an invitation to them. At the beginning, we really had really good participation, but not lately. So I think that. Thank you, Christal. You put another to-do on my list of things to maybe reach out.
I'll put a to-do on my list. Okay. I mean, we can anybody listening to this right now can, it's very easy to access your representatives and say, you should get to that graduation.
Get to that graduation. They will convince you. Absolutely.
Yes.
They will convince you.
I'm sending this out to all the listeners and viewers right now. Get in touch with the people who represent you and say, hey, I want you to attend that graduation.
Wonderful. I love it. Free advertising.
There you go. As we get ready to close things out here, I want to ask about your future outlook on this. And hope is the thing that keeps you in the work. What gives you hope right now about the future of adult education?
At the very beginning, when I first started in this position, I was the outlier because I was paired with Michigan Works, and they were considered in adult education the enemy because they were trying to take over adult education. What gives me hope is I was the only program across over 300 programs across adult education in Michigan to be partnered and work with Michigan Works. Now I'm not the unusual one. No longer am I the unusual one. Almost everybody has a partner and is working closely and recognizing. And, the importance of that is because adult education is just not about getting your GED or high school diploma. It's about building a future and knowing what the next steps are and using education to know what those next steps are. So that makes me excited.
I have to say, if someone is listening right now and they're considering returning to school, but they're feeling afraid or ashamed, or, they're going, well, what's the point? I'm 50 years old. I'm 60 years old. I don't know what that's really going to do for me. What would you say to them?
Well, I'd use the old slogan, just do it. Just do it. I think once they get through the door, we've got such a great staff. They care, and I think the students understand that. So once they get in there, they won't feel intimidated. They'll feel like it's home. So they just need to get there and get through the door. And I guarantee you, I guarantee you'll feel comfortable once you get there.
Gosh, Christy, I have loved this conversation so much. And I want to say again, congratulations on that well-deserved award. I mean, you've done incredible work in this space. It's really an honor and a privilege to be able to work with you, and also to be able to sit here with this conversation. And I can't wait to come to graduation. I couldn't go the last couple of years, so I'm like, it's on my calendar. I am going. I'm going to be moved to tears in such a good way.
Yes, you will.
I can't wait. Adult education is about so much more than a diploma or a GED. It's about dignity and confidence and opportunity and stability, and often rewriting an entire family story. So big congratulations to all of the graduates preparing for the June 10th ceremony. And thank you to you, Christy, and the entire adult education team at Northwest Michigan Works and Networks Northwest. This is truly life-changing work that you do across every day across our region. You can learn more about adult education services through Northwest Michigan Works Adult Education. And as always, thank you for listening to Currently the Conversation. It's brought to you by TVC Cherry Capital Airport, your Northern Michigan connection.